started. Thanks for coming again to the Department of Education Reform's lecture series. Just so I can advertise something coming up, the Friday after Thanksgiving we'll have Beth Dewey from the University of Toronto. And that should be a great lecture, so I encourage you to RSVP for that and attend her lecture 2 weeks from today. Today, we have a slightly larger crowd because there's a research advisory board meeting going on for the school choice demonstration project at the same time that we already had Matt Ladner scheduled. So in part it's because Matt is so fantastic, and in part it's because we have a bunch of other people already here. Matt is the senior advisor for something or other with the Foundation for Excellence in Education, otherwise known as the Jeb Bush Foundation. And prior to that, Matt has been with the Goldwater Institute, with the Alliance for School Choice, and a list of Rhodes Gallery organizations. And he received his PhD from the University of Houston, actually while I was there, but I don't think we actually really knew each other, which is a weird thing. And prior to that, he received his BA from the University of Texas, but no one's perfect. So with that, I'd like to introduce Matt Ladner, who will talk to us today about Rawls and Friedman.
Thanks, Jay. First of all, let me say that it's really an honor to be here. And when Jay asked me to come, I was like, oh, okay, I can come. And I kind of struggled with what I'd like to talk about. And usually, I guess, you're supposed to come in here and talk about something you know a lot about. And I thought about doing that, but I decided I didn't want to do that. Instead, I was hoping to talk about something that I've been kind of puzzling over and working on in my own mind. And I thought, well, this is really a great opportunity for me because I've really been out of a scholarly environment for, say, since I graduated from graduate school in 1996. Since then, I've mostly been in kind of the policy advocacy world, legislative strategy, stuff like that. So to me, it's kind of a great opportunity to be here to talk with people about kind of a more scholarly subject, and I'm hoping that you guys will actually kind of inform me. And I don't want this just to be just from me to you. I want you to talk. I know there are people in the audience who know a lot more about what I'm going to be bringing up than I do. Okay, so I'm interested in these two gentlemen, who of course were two of the titans of intellectual thought in the 20th century. Milton Friedman, of course, the one on the left, and John Rawls on the right.
There must be a point here.
Kind of. I'll just reveal my biases to begin with. I'm a right winger, and I'm much more a philosophically inclined towards Friedman and Rawls. But I've increasingly over the years found myself being kind of an oddball right winger because I'm fascinated with Rawls. And some of my right-wing colleagues find this kind of offensive and crazy, but this is my dilemma. This is what I'm kind of trying to work through, because I've come increasingly to the position that the positions of these two guys they're not that far off from each other. There are differences in emphasis. There are massive differences in the way these two gentlemen are interpreted. They're often presented as polar opposites from each other. I don't actually think they are, but I'm not sure. So hopefully we can kind of sort through this. Friedman, of course, is best known for saying things like, free markets over time will deliver the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay? That's basic Friedmanism, right? He also makes the claim that advances secured by capitalism will help the least advantaged the most. And probably most provocatively, he likes to say things like, even poor people used to like to say things before he passed away, even the poor of today live better than the monarchs of a century ago. Right? I happen to agree with all of that. I think he's right. I wouldn't change my place with a English king or an Egyptian pharaoh or anything. They didn't have indoor plumbing or cell phones. So, also obviously want to discuss education along the way, since this all will come back to that, right? And my distillation of Friedman on the education issue, which of course was one of Milton's great passions, was education reform. My distillation of Friedman is, why are the Detroit public schools so bad? Ultimately because they can be, right? At a sort of permissive level, how can you have a school district that spends $13,000 per child, and yet in the late 90s, which were reporting dropout rates of 75%? How do you manage that, right? There's no simple answer to that. There's no one cause for that, right? But Friedman's answer was, is it basically because they can, right? There's nothing in the way of it happening. You can have those kind of results year after year after year, decade after decade after decade, and there are no negative consequences attached to the people who are benefiting from the status quo. Ergo, Friedman says we should have school vouchers, and he, of course, detailed a number of benefits that he believed would happen with school vouchers, including a systemic improvement of the actual district school system itself. Okay. Rawls. Now, Rawls, of course, is most famous for the sort of veil of ignorance thought experiment, right? And Rawls argues that we should design societal ethics and our policies around the idea that there's sort of this great reincarnation to come, right? And in this thought experiment, you don't know who you're going to be in the next life. Right? You could be born the son of Bill Gates. You could be born the son of an inner city crack addict, right? You don't know. So basically, Rawls makes the argument that if that were the situation, that you would at a minimum want to have societal policy set up so that there's at least a way out if you draw the short end of the stick, right? If you wind up the son or daughter of a crack addict, right, it's not going to automatically doom you to failure, right? Because that's, Rawls and Friedman both, but especially Rawls, he's a very complicated thinker. He wrote different things at different times. He's been interpreted a variety of different ways, and I'm certainly not an expert on Rawls. But that's my installation of my interest in Rawls. Bruce Akerman says that we Rawls liberals believe that we have a special responsibility to arrange the starting points of American citizens in a way worthy of the playing with quality. But we don't have a responsibility to save them from the mistakes that confront us. I think Martha Nussbaum's distillation is an important point. The ideas that set up some upper limits on the ability of luck to form human lives. Okay? You can go and read, it's actually Google Books has it. There's a great book by Matthew Miller, who was an aide to Bill Clinton. And it's called The 2% Solution. Okay? And the 2% Solution has a chapter called Taking Luck Seriously. And in Taking Luck Seriously, Miller actually goes and interviews Friedman. Friedman, as early as the 1950s, was writing academic articles, written in turgid, calculations and whatnot, trying to dismiss the importance of luck. Right? Friedman understood that this idea of inherited wealth or even inherited talents was problematic, right? Problematic from a free market standpoint. It was very interesting. I highly recommend it. You go just Google it. You can read it on the Google Books. Read the whole chapter. It's very interesting. When Matthew Miller asked Friedman about this, Friedman actually says, "Oh well, now you're asking the difficult question, right?" Miller was asking questions like, "What role does luck play?" And Friedman says, "It's an enormous role." Like he named his own biography. He and his wife Rose, two lucky people. Friedman was a man who was born very poor, right? And obviously those notions ranks. So usually Rawls and Friedman are thought of as being polar opposites, right? Friedman being this free market capitalist, and Rawls being, a more ambiguous figure, I would say. But a lot of people have sort of interpreted Rawls. I think the least charitable interpretation of Rawls is that you could say that he serves as sort of a justifying myth for the growth of the welfare state, for instance. Okay? I don't think that's necessarily what Rawls himself said. Okay, but that's how a lot of right-wingers interpret Rawls. What did Rawls actually say about public policy in schools in particular? If you have that risk of being bored and son of a crack addict, what should we do about that? Right? The answer is not a lot. Right? When you look at what Rawls actually proposed, he basically said that there should be either a public school system or subsidies for private schooling. That doesn't sound terribly radical to me, right? And also, he said that we should provide what we call the social minimum. Now, when you get into the social minimum, this is very interesting because actually Milton Friedman was a proponent of something called the negative income tax, right? And to me, the differences between the social minimum and the negative income tax are negligible. Conceptually, they're very similar. Friedman himself called for this negative income tax because for the same basic reasons that Rawls does, right? Now, Friedman says that he would prefer that this be provided by charity, preferably, ideally, right? But all else being equal, he says this is the way to do it. And Friedman was actually quite concerned about the best way to do these functions, right? He actually conceded these. Most of the differences between Friedman and Rawls was about concerns that Friedman had. And this comes out very clearly in the Matthew Miller interview. Concerns that Friedman had about the general idea of society, of government promoting equality. That concerned him because there's an obvious question of once you start down that road, where does it stop, right? Does it go too far? Now, I think all this is relevant to my work in education reform because, I see a huge and growing influence for Rawlsianism in the discussion of education reform. If you've seen the movie Waiting for Superman, John Rawls is the unseen director of this film, right? He's the main character of the film, in my opinion. He's just not on stage, right? If you've seen the beginning of the film, the actual director, Guggenheim, drives past a number of bad public schools, right? Sort of chiding himself as a good liberal who believes in public education. But these schools are not good enough for my kids. So I drive past them, drive past another one, and drive past another one until I drop my child off at a private school where I'm fortunate enough to be able to afford. He basically says, I do this because it's the right thing to do for my child, but it makes me feel guilty. Right? The second half of the film is dominated by a discussion of lotteries for children getting into charter schools. Okay? Again, the obvious Rawlsian theme to this, right? You sit there and watch these desperately poor people enter into lotteries to get into some very high-quality charter schools in New York, Washington, Los Angeles, and it is simply crushing emotionally to watch them lose, which is what happens to most of them, right? Now, we don't design lotteries. We have lotteries in voucher programs. We have lotteries for charter schools. We don't design these things because we want to be cruel, right? We use lotteries because we're trying to be fair, right? We use lotteries because there are more people that want seats than there are seats available, right? We don't want a system where people can buy their way into the schools, or if they're better connected and that sort of thing, the better connected parents can get their kids into schools. So they use lotteries, but actually watching these lotteries play out and watch these people lose them and break down in tears, is very difficult. Okay? And in my mind, the big change in education reform debate, and from my standpoint, I'd say over the last 5 years, has been actually kind of the evolution of thinking on the left. Okay? We Friedmanites are still out there, we're still doing our things, but we're not driving the debate. Okay? And if you go back to this, I think what's going on now is a number of Rawlsians are looking at this and saying, that's not good enough. Right? So what if you get born with the short end of the stick? So we create a public school system for you. But what if that public school system is the Detroit Public Schools? Or DCPS? Or the Dallas Independent School District? Or fill in the blank here? Right? Is that adequate? The answer that people are increasingly come to is no. It's not adequate. It's profoundly inadequate. Right? We know these schools. We know the results. We know who they serve well. They're not, not all public schools are failures by any stretch of the imagination, nor are every charter school, fantastic success, or anything like that. Okay? There's a lot of wonderful public schools and a lot of good people working. The point is that we can look at places like Dallas, Houston, like just Baltimore, fill in the blank, right? The average results of these places are really, really atrocious. Okay? So, Rawls was not as nearly as applied as Friedman, right? He didn't go diving into the weeds regarding policy design the way Friedman did, right? It was much more at kind of a philosophical level. But I certainly I interpret sort of the rise of the waiting for Superman liberals, which are having a really, really big impact on education now, is basically kind of taking the next logical step of the Rawlsian philosophy. Yes, if I got the short end of the stick, I'd like there to be a public school system, perhaps, or, as Rawls himself said, some sort of subsidies for me to go to a private school. But that's not good enough, right? We don't want to have a system by itself, right? We can pretend that having a system gives you a shot. You can even argue that it does give you a shot, right? I can go to the Los Angeles School District, I have teachers, I have textbooks, I have a desk to sit at, right? Even if I'm desperately poor and I'm sitting in some of the worst performing schools in America, you could say, right, that I've been given my equality of opportunity. But I don't believe that. I don't think Guggenheim believes that, right? And I think this is what's really kind of driving the change in debate these days. Okay? It's not that there's been a massive correction of education policy on the left, but there's certainly a big change. There's a legitimate debate going on now within left of center circles about what K-12 policy ought to look like. Here's the big problem, of course. When you look at big Mediterranean American education, what you see is that per pupil spending has gone up substantially, but academic achievement is not. Okay? These are the long-term NAEP trend scores. They're relatively flat. Spending is up. And this is what really tends to bother me, but it really bothers a lot of people. I don't know who this shouldn't bother. Strangely enough, this is a chart from a study that I actually have heard several sort of anti-reform proponents referring to. The study done by the United States Department of Education that is looking at PISA data and breaking it down by different groups within America. Okay? These are 15-year-olds and math scores. And the thing that you hear most often is that top line. Okay? I've heard, for instance, Diane Ravitch talks about this. She says, if you look at American schools where 10% or less of our students qualify for a free reduced lunch, then we actually outscore the top performing country. Korea. Anyone want to guess what the multiple problems with that is?
How do you think the very richest schools in Korea do, for starters?
Right? Is this a remotely fair comparison? No. This is the very, very, very best of our schools compared to a national average. Right? Now, I'm glad that our very, very, very highest performing schools can outperform Korea, but I don't know how much that really tells us. Right? I don't think it tells us very much. Here's the more concerning part of this. Are numbers like this, and like that, this. The national average in Mexico is a 425. Okay? There's a lot more poverty in Mexico than there is here in the United States. When you, best I can tell, looking at the international statistics, you can control currency differences and all that kind of stuff. But we spend approximately, from what I can tell, about 4 times as much per pupil in our public school system as they do in Mexico. Okay? Can anybody justify or live with the fact that American blacks score much, 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 much closer to the Mexican average, right, than they do for the average of whites, for the average of Korea? Why is our Hispanic number so low? Right? This is not a comforting source of data to me. Right? I don't look at this and say, everything's swell. We don't have anything to worry about. Right? Or I also don't look at this and say, oh, it's all just poverty. Right? If only we were all fabulously wealthy like they are in those 10% of schools, then everything would be great. Okay, that's not going to be happening anytime soon. Right? I mean, viewed from this prism, you can actually make an argument, wow, Mexico must be a really, really efficient school system because they produce results similar to the Baltimore or Detroit public schools, right? For a quarter of the money, right? That's not very comforting either. So these kinds of issues are really important, and ultimately what this leads into is a discussion of the achievement gap. Now, in 1997, Lawrence Stedman made this statement. I'll let you read it for yourself. But when I first read this statement, I was stunned. I thought this was breathtaking. This couldn't, in fact, go look up the numbers. I thought there's no way this could be true. Okay? Oops. It's still true today. Stedman said that in 1997. This is the most recent data available. Okay? These are reading scores. 12th grade African Americans, 268. 12th grade Hispanics, 63. 8th grade whites, 71. Okay. That's problematic. Right? Now, Jay and I recently, Rick Hess and other people, have been kind of having a debate a little bit on Jay's blog about racial achievement gaps. And should racial achievement gaps kind of be the organizing principle of our education reform? I don't think they should, but I do think they're really, really very important. And it's not because I think that racial achievement gaps or income-based achievement gaps or whatever can necessarily be closed. Right? I think Rick has made the argument that might be setting up an unrealistic expectation. And he might be right. There's more that goes into academic achievement than anything that we can control in the schools. But when I see something like this, my reaction is, surely we can do better than this, right? Ought we not to expect something closer than this, right? This is showing the black-white achievement gap in all 4 NAEP subjects, and the change in the achievement gap between 2003 and 2009. Okay? And it's showing it for all 4 of the main NAEP subjects. So that's 4th grade reading at the end, 4th grade math. Okay? And as a point of reference, kind of a rough rule of thumb, 10% 10 points on this test is about worth about approximately your grade level's worth of progress. Right? If I took a group of 5th graders and gave them the 4th grade reading test on NAEP, all else being equal somehow, right? I would expect them to do about 10 points better. Okay? So what does this mean? Well, in 4th grade reading, 2003, there was almost a 30-point difference between blacks and whites. Right? That's down to 25. It's progress. It's not much progress. Right? Math, etc. The data is this an out, basically adding them all up together. Okay? Across 4 tests, you're looking at about 100 point difference. At this pace, it's going to be a long, long, long time before the achievement gap is closed.
But if you look at the 10 years before this, the gap was widening by, I think, around 5 points on this. What scale is this? Just as a bar scale.
500, yeah.
So if you look at the swing between the 90s and, let's say, the pre-NCLB and the post-NCLB era, the swing has been a much more positive development than if you just looked at what's happened since.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I'll take some progress over no progress any day of the week, right? And not only that, progress actually varies a lot across states, which I'm going to show you in a minute. The funny thing was, this is Jay and I started this conversation on the blog. I just finished writing a chapter about the racial achievement gap. And in that chapter, before I actually looked at the data, I theorized that there could be like these really strange things that can happen in achievement gaps, and you needed to be very, very careful with them because they could be misleading. And then I found actual examples of it happening. Okay, achievement gaps are very tricky, and I think that there are good reasons to be very cautious with them at least. So, for instance, the worst case scenario here, this is actually happening in Virginia, is that you can have the narrowing of an achievement gap, for instance, the black-white achievement gap in West Virginia, because both your white students are doing worse, your black students are doing worse, but your white students are making bigger losses at a faster rate than your black students. The appearance of a narrowing of a gap. It's not in the appearance, it is a narrowing of a gap. It's just highly undesirable, right? Yes?
I'm concerned about poverty issues. In West Virginia, they have a declining population, and the population is an aging population. So what you're seeing is a middle class moving away from West Virginia and leaving people who are too poor, too unable to have that opportunity to leave. And yet you're putting it a little differently, that whereas I would be talking about addressing the poverty, and in some of these others also. For example, the graph you showed on other countries, we have two things going on there, wouldn't we? How do you define literacy, as well as how did you define the poverty issue within the context of that graph? To me, that was I would have interpreted it differently. Yeah, that's the one.
Which one? Okay, so the poverty, this is done by the United States Department of Education. So they're defining poverty by the Freedmen and Rawls lunch standard.
Not poverty. The question I have here is a literacy question. Some countries they'll tell you 98, Nicaragua, they'll tell you 98% of their people are literate. But that's because if you can make an X.
Well, but this is a standardized test that's given across all these countries.
That's what I guess I'd like to see the data on.
Yeah, I mean, you can Google the study. I mean, all the poverty stuff are determined by standard measures that we use here in the United States, and the data source is an international testing by the OECD. So that would be fairly common.
But my question was poverty. You've got the 10% doing well, and that would be expected, I would think. And in the same way, as you go down, you're doing worse. I did like the middle, that was kind of interesting.
Right.
Anyway, that was just...
Why are poor Americans doing so comparably to Mexican students when we spend 4 times as much on computers.
Well, we don't spend it in the same place. If you have a poor school system, the rich school system helps you average it out.
But over the last 30 years, there's been a very big move, at least towards equalizing resources between districts. And even our low-income districts are not going to be spending any towards excellence. I think the unavoidable conclusion is that we don't make very good use of our money here in the United States. That's my opinion.
It's also the salaries.
Oh, yeah, right.
I'm sorry, I keep
Salaries are higher.
salaries are higher than some.
Right, but we have a reasonable expectation, I think, right, it's the moral judgment on my part to expect that results from this. The next item, the action you see is happening in Washington, D.C. Is this a problem? We have a between 2003 and 2009, a very large increase in the white light achievement gap in Washington, D.C. Very large. Now, there's all kinds of factors that are going into that. There's a lot of gentrification going on in Washington, D.C. But, Washington, D.C. also has some of the biggest gains for poor kids going on. Okay? A lot of this is, people coming into town, they've got a job with the federal government, instead of moving out in the suburbs and moving into town to be closer, there's a lot of stuff going on, similar to what you described in West Virginia. Okay? Is this a problem?
That's the kind of problem I'd like to have.
Yes.
The comment on your FRL numbers for the U.S., that doesn't mean, where was it from the chart? That top one, that does include a lot of wealthy schools, but that doesn't mean that it's the 10% wealthiest schools or districts in the country.
That's right.
It's just schools with low numbers of people eligible for free or reduced lunch. So,
right.
I mean, you could go to Greenwood, Arkansas, right? Greenwood has a low percentage of FRL.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean the parking lot's full of Rolls Royces and Lexuses.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So I think that should be pointed out with those numbers, that this is not strictly economically stratified.
Right, but the schools that are 10% or less.
There's a correlation.
Yeah, a pretty strong, right?
Poverty. What's the poverty rate in Finland?
I don't know.
I think we'd want to know about the
Yeah, this study was able to break that down. What they were able to do is break down the Americans sample because it was big enough to
I
get
think what
into.
Jeff's saying though is that top part is
The richest country in the world.
Not necessarily.
more often than not. I mean, DC spends 18,000 per student. I'm sure they're not in that top part.
DC's a pretty weird amount.
I mean, you know what I'm saying?
It's one you chose. It is one you chose. I mean, that was your choice.
No, that's not my choice. It's the United States Department of Education's.
In the other graph is what I mean. In your sample. Your example, your breakdown, West Virginia.
Oh, right.
Washington, D.C.,
Yeah,
Florida.
that's FRLR too.
That was your choice.
Yeah. This one. Right. No, but there we're using standard free reduced lunch eligibility too. But you're right, like these things are not perfectly correlated or anything. You're right. Okay. Although I think if we looked at schools that have 10% or less, I mean, you're talking about a very advantaged set of schools.
How many things are we talking about?
That's a good question too. I don't know. The report might have that, but I don't. Okay. So anyway, yeah, the DC thing is kind of the problem I'd like to have. The really only good, or at least the most desirable way to close the racial achievement gap is if your disadvantaged students are making gains, your advantaged students are making gains, but your disadvantaged students are making gains at a faster rate than your advantaged. If you do that, now you're really making progress, right? You're not relying on your advantaged students going backwards to close the gap, right? You've got all students moving in the right direction, right? The gap is closing. This was the experience in Florida, okay? I mentioned earlier that although the national numbers, you only see that 10-point decline between the black-white achievement gap, there's a lot of variation at the state level, okay? There are states going in the wrong direction, which are the positive numbers, and there are states going in the right direction in much larger rates than the national average, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that we, got to nail down all the reasons why this is happening. It's happening for 1,000 different reasons, right? But aspire to do more and do better, right? Hopefully. I think that, as sort of a Friedman night, I actually kind of like the idea of taking the Rawls challenge. I think it is appropriate for us to judge the efforts of states and schools based on the results of the least advantaged kids, right? And here in America, that is typically your free reduced lunch eligible population, okay? That's kind of our standard measure, and it's not perfect, and there's a problem. But nonetheless, it's not that I don't want gains amongst kids who don't qualify for free reduced lunch. I do, right? But I do think that it is fair for us to judge the quality of efforts by how it treats the kids that start off with the least, right? These are the ones we want to see gap closings, and we want to see real progress. We really need these kids to make progress, okay? Now, as I do my work for the Foundation for Excellence in Education, I like touting stuff like this, okay? Many of you, or all of you, will probably remember Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He was a liberal Democrat from New York, but he was also George Will's favorite senator. George Will once said that Daniel Patrick Moynihan has written more books than most senators have read. Moynihan had this joke where he said, well, performance on the nation's report card is perfectly correlated with proximity to the Canadian border. Right. So, if states want to improve their academic performance, what they should simply do is pack up and move closer to Canada. Right? Now, I think that if Moynihan were alive today, we'd be kind of pleased to see this map. Okay? This is a map of fourth grade reading scores, and I'm only showing you the fourth grade reading scores for Hispanic students in Florida. That's 223 in 2009. Update this yet. 2011 came out. And these are the statewide average numbers in all these other states. And what I'm showing you are the states where Florida Hispanics either tie or outscore the statewide average. Okay? Yes?
But that's a heavily Cuban population, right? Or is it?
Ah, yes. Let me tell you a story about that. I live in Arizona, okay? And I discovered this by random chance that in 2007, that Florida's Hispanics were outscoring the statewide average for all students in my state of Arizona. Okay? Now, I think you are probably all aware that there's a little illegal immigration issue in Arizona. So, the education debate in Arizona had kind of been frozen. And we had two problems. The first problem was called the Democrats. The Democrats had the normal Democrat problem on education policy. Don't need to explain what that is. Our other problem was called the Republicans. Now, the problem with the Republicans was more subtle, but it was just as real. The problem with the Republicans is that they've been running the Arizona House of Representatives since 1966. Arizona has really bad NAEP scores, right? So we needed a way to reconcile this, right? The school districts, of course, always want more money. The Republicans generally don't want to give it to them, but they're also having a hard time living with the fact that our scores are so just abysmally low, right? So what do? Well, at some point, you find this RAND Corporation study, and the RAND Corporation study says, hey, Arizona lawmakers, don't worry about it too much, because if you control for demographics, right, Arizona's not at the bottom, we're kind of in the mediocre middle. What a relief. Right? You control for demographics. Now look, it's true, Arizona has a very difficult to educate, pretty difficult to educate K-12 population, right? We actually do have kids coming up from Mexico that don't know how to read Spanish. It happens, right? You know, we have more than our fair share of free reduced lunch eligible kids, okay? But what I could never get across to people in Arizona is that in the end, in the real world, you don't get to control for demographics. You don't. Nor do they really understand what that meant, right? I would try to explain it to them.
that means you're waving a magical statistical wand and saying, if you make 2/3 of our Hispanic kids go away, bing! Right? If you make 1/3 of our poor kids go away, if you make even more of our ELL kids go away, then we're kind of average. Okay, that's great. But it doesn't really do me any good in the real world, right? In the real world, taxpayers in Arizona are putting out about $10,000 total from all sources, about $10,000 per kid, and rightfully close to half of our fourth graders score below basic in reading in fourth grade. I don't care where they're from or what they look like or whatever. That's not good enough for me, right? I think the future of Arizona is very dependent on our ability to get Hispanic kids, all kids, including Hispanic kids, to learn how to read. Okay? So when I found this Florida number, right, and I started advertising it around the state and saying, look, Florida's Hispanics are outscoring your statewide average, and not by just a little bit, by quite a bit, on a test which is given in English, right? I got deluged with email. Right? My machine practically came grinding to a halt, right? And the response I got was just what you just said about Ladner, you silly boy, you don't understand. Florida, Hispanics, Cubans. Cubans are rich Republicans. Okay, now, my grandfather, God rest his soul, used to own a house down in the Florida Keys. And I knew that was bullshit. That's a technical French term. Right? I'd seen whole families of these rich Republicans knocking on my grandfather's door because they wanted to clean his house for $20. Okay? Republicans? Maybe. Definitely. Rich? No. Well, then I went into the census data. In the year 2000, only 30% of Hispanics in Florida were Cubans. And mysteriously enough, back before the education reforms put in place, those magic Cubans didn't score all that well. Right? They scored a little bit better than the national average for Hispanics, but not much. Okay? And then you see exactly the same trend for whites and for blacks. So I had to tell them, hey, if you've got a magic Cuban theory, you need a magic Haitian theory, and you need a magic Bubba theory. Because everybody's scores are going up, right? They still wouldn't accept it. I was still getting bombed like that. You're an idiot, Ladner. You don't understand. Cubans, right? So I started to get mean. I went into the data and I was like, okay, you got your rich Cuban theory, so let me just tell you, I'm breaking the numbers down by ethnicity and by income. Free and reduced lunch eligible Hispanics outscore the statewide average for all students in Arizona. Okay?
This is, you have tripped lightly on the only thing I know anything about. And the truth of the matter is it's not poverty with the Cuban idea. There is a large population, especially in Miami, of Cubans who have come here. The difference is, no, they're not rich because they came here as refugees. And so, but what they were was educated. They were very well educated. And so what you find is that they are a different population from people who, as you say, it happens that they went to school in Mexico, or they never went to school in Mexico, and they didn't learn to read.
That's a unique Hispanic population. It's also got
That's
a lot of people,
well done.
international, Argentinians, and all, I mean, it's unique, okay? But what I can tell you is, back in 1998, they didn't sniff anybody's statewide average, not even close. Okay? Governor Bush put his reform package in 1999. Didn't get close. Okay? Florida's African American students in 2009 on this test outscored or tied 8 different statewide averages. Okay? Including my state of Arizona again. Okay? Now, back before the reforms, nowhere close to a statewide average. Okay? I mean, you got to think about what this means. Okay? So Arizona, our statewide average is 210. That statewide average includes all of our kids, our entire sample. Okay? So all of our kids in Scottsdale, all of our kids in Prescott, Flagstaff, County, and Foothills, all the wealthy white areas, it's all there, and it's 210, right? Only looking at African American, only looking at game. This is like, Florida fighting with one hand tied behind his back and getting a first round knockout. Okay? So, yes, it's definitely true that there are unique things about Florida, but, ultimately this is not, you cannot explain what happened. Prove it, right? I like showing charts like this. This is comparing Florida and California and Hispanic scores, fourth grade reading, showing this is achievement level, actually for free and reduced lunch eligible Hispanic students. 1998. Now, Florida was better than California. California was catastrophically bad, right? 22% of free and reduced lunch eligible Hispanics in Florida, California in 1998. You had a rate, basically, right? So we're basically better. There's been progress in California, but there's been a lot more progress in Florida. Okay? So, the point here is not, on my part, it's not to bash states, it's not to bash public schools. I'm a public school kid myself. My mother was a public school teacher, and I genuinely believe that, we got to have public school work. Our future depends on it. Okay? So the message that I take from the experience is look, it is possible to move the needle in a meaningful way. It's not easy, right? And it's very controversial and difficult, but it can be done. In the Florida experience, we like showing pictures like this one, right? This is from a rally held in Tallahassee a couple of years ago that was in favor of a big improvement in the private scholarship program. This was a program called the Step Up for Students Tax Credit Program. It's tax credits basically, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, allow corporations. This one lets corporations make donations to nonprofits. They take a dollar for dollar tax credit against their corporate income tax, and then they make scholarships available to low-income kids. Those kids can either use that money to pay transportation costs between public schools. Not very many of them do that, or to go to private schools. This was actually the largest rally held in Tallahassee since the Civil Rights era. It makes a pretty striking visual, right? I think that there's given everything that's happened in education reform, especially last year, was a big year, not just for school choice, but across a variety of different policy areas. You saw a lot of states doing a lot of things that would have been kind of unthinkable a few years ago. Things like widespread teacher evaluations now that are including student learning gains as part of the menu. Big school choice programs, a very big school choice program passed in Indiana, in addition to a lot of other reforms. But I do kind of worry that we might kind of go from that triumphalism, right, and forget what we're really involved in here. And what we're really involved in doing K-12 reforms, from my perspective, as someone that kind of does it from hand-to-hand combat level, is we're really involved in sort of trench warfare. Okay? The opponents of reform in K-12 education are very powerful, and they still are now. If you've read Terry Moe's book, his most recent book about the teacher unions, he makes a very compelling case that, and it's not, of course, not just the teacher unions, but the teacher unions just by themselves are a very large, very well-funded, very well-organized political force that is organized down to the state legislative district level in every single state in this country. And generally, they don't like certain types of ed reform. Right? And
are the teachers' unions stronger in Arizona than in Florida?
I wouldn't put either state on the top end, if I had to guess. No, I'd say they're probably stronger in Florida than Arizona, but neither one of them are, Illinois or Massachusetts or something like that. Yeah. So, this is not, I think that we've been guilty in the reform movement in the past of kind of telling stories about tipping points, right? Well, such and such happened, and now everything is going to go our way, right? This happened, now it's going to change the game forever, right? And inevitably, this sets us up for problems, right? People
fixing problems as big as the ones I showed you a few slides ago is not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen next year. It's not going to happen the year after that. It's not going to be a decade from now. And I think it's best to just go ahead and reconcile. At least that's what I've done myself. I'm reconciling to the fact this fight is still going to be going on, I think, when I'm dead. Okay, no matter how long I live. That doesn't mean the fight isn't happening. So, kind of like just to sum up and bring this back to Rawls and Friedman. Friedman made this statement, and this is actually how I believe how he dealt with the difficulties that Rawls presented to him with this statement, right? He basically said, and it's clear that when you read the interviews and people directly put sort of Rawls' challenge to Friedman, he shies away from it. He doesn't like it. He doesn't want to talk about trying to promote equality because he thinks it's going to get out of hand. Right? And there's I think reasons to do that. Ultimately, Friedman kind of concluded by saying that a society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both. I believe that. I think that's right. I don't think that means that Friedman is right and Rawls is wrong. I think that both of them have a lot of very valuable insights, and I would particularly say that I think Rawls succeeded in putting his philosophy in a way, in a moral context that is far more appealing to people. When you see people walk out of Waiting for Superman, they've been moved in a way that you don't get from reading economics or freedom. Right? I'm not sure why that is, but it's a failing on our part as on the right.
Well, so on this point exactly, Rawls would not disagree with that, because I recall Rawls, and it's been a while, but as I recall, he said the fundamental principle is liberty, and the second principle is you want to let somebody be only as well off as is necessary to make the least well off better. So clearly he put freedom ahead of equality, and he qualified the amount of equality to the point where it didn't undermine the productivity necessary to generate the wealth that would help the least well off. So I don't really think on this point either there's a difference between the two.
Right. Now, when I look at this second dot here, and I see Rawls say that the social minimum, we should provide this without setting the tax rates too high to hurt the poor or compromise the saving investment needed for future growth. This is basically what he's making. I look at that and I say, that kind of looks like assume a can opener to me, right? We want to do this good thing, but we want to do it so there's no trade-offs. That's hard to do, right? I mean, there are trade-offs, but I'm willing to live with something like this that basically says, we're going to work it out with, right? At some point, we could do something like this, and it would become socially unacceptable to pay the taxes. It could go too high, it could have perverse and unintended consequences. But I actually completely agree with you. I don't think these two philosophies are all that antithetical to each other, and I do think that Friedman did a lot of things that are consistent. When you see social minimums and negative income taxes, to me, it's tomato. Yes, sir.
Think about Friedman's observation on the Detroit public schools, that they're as bad as they are because they can avoid them. And I was wondering if you don't think that either a federal constitutional amendment or just a law requiring that every federal official, say in Congress, in the cabinet, the White House, send a child to public school might not have a more lasting institutional reform effect than any specific thing. I look back at who's been going to Sidwell Friends over the last couple of decades, and the names come up like Gore, Clinton,
Chelsea
Obama,
Clinton,
and so on.
Obama.
So essentially, the political elite, when push comes to shove, are able to opt their kids out of the
That's right.
and if they can't, they'll have a hell of a bigger incentive to deal with it solve problems.
Yeah, I think that this was absolutely the most powerful argument to use against the Trump administration's attempt to kill the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. The fact of the matter is that President Obama exercised his right as a parent to send his twins to Sidwell Friends.
They're not twins.
They're not twins.
No, not twins.
They're not twins.
I thought they were twins. You learn something every day. Okay, his girls, his daughters. Look, if I were him, I'd send my kids to Sidwell Friends.
Bush
Bush twins, that's it. Yeah, they were already out of school before Bush went to Washington. But the point that you see a lot of people making now is that if DC public schools aren't good enough for you in theory, right, then they're not good enough for these kids that are actually there in practice, right? So I find that to be a very compelling argument.
Well, I certainly sympathize with your position that Friedman and Rawls are much more similar in their perspective and their prescriptions than a lot of people think. I think one point where they diverge, though, in the field I study, school vouchers, would be in the type of voucher that should be offered. I mean, Friedman would advocate universal vouchers of equal value for all, whereas Rawls would want something like weighted vouchers that are more valuable for students with certain disadvantages. I mean, that would just nail the difference principle, perfectly.
Are you sure that Friedman would have been against a weighted student voucher?
I don't know of any point in which he advocated it.
I don't either. And he certainly very strongly supported universal vouchers. And this is, of course, a major fault line within the school choice movement between people who are universalists and people who are more interested in means-tested or somehow otherwise weighted vouchers. And to me, this is one of those arguments that just flat out worn me out, right? I'm kind of, like every time someone brings it up, I'm like, what is it, 1997 again? Do we really do this? But it is important, but I think the elegant solution to it is to do the options that you listed, which is if you're going to do vouchers, why not make them universal? There are really compelling reasons to do that, but why not also weight them, right? Why not I'm willing to give universal vouchers that they give substantially more money to low-income kids, substantially more money to kids with disabilities and whatnot, and to reflect equity issues that way. Because if you don't do it that way, I think the experience in Milwaukee with means testing, you create some really perverse things. You get married, your income goes up, and now you're not eligible for the school voucher. That's not something we want to do. We don't want to discourage people from getting promoted at work, that sort of thing. So I think a sliding scale universal approach is ideal in my mind, but I'm happy to support a means tested voucher if that's what's possible at the time. Better that than nothing. Yes.
So you showed this picture of trench warfare and talked about education reform being trench warfare, but I think really educational progress itself is trench warfare. Just improving education is trench warfare. So why set it up? It's the trench warfare between reformers and the unions, or reformers and traditional ed schools, or whatever. Why is that the trench warfare, not just saying there's a war going on and we need to come together and improve?
War on terror, an abstraction.
Right, a war on low NAEP scores.
Yeah, war on low NAEP scores.
That would be nice. I think if I could reference one of Terry Moe's early, the book he wrote before the one that just came out, the shorter book called Liberating Learning. Terry tells what I think is hilarious. In fact, he was in the next this as well. Tells what I think is just an hysterical story to kind of sum up the whole history of ed reform in America since publication of Nation at Risk in the early 80s, right? So Nation at Risk comes out in the early 80s, blue ribbon panel report from the Reagan administration. It's hyper bombastic language, right? If a foreign power had imposed these lousy public schools on us, by God, we'd go to war over it. As it is, we've done this to ourselves, right? Facing a rising tide of mediocrity. Look, I don't want to make fun fun of it because it's true, right? But what happened from that standpoint was then you had like basically education reform efforts, put that in quotation marks, in all 50 states. I was an 8th grader in Texas when this was going on, okay? And this is when Governor Mark White, who's a Democrat, an old Tory Democrat in Texas, put in the beginnings of what turned into the state accountability exam in Texas, and then from there on to No Child Left Behind eventually, okay? But he also put in a test, a minimal competency test for public school teachers, and the unions went to war on this. Ultimately, they lost the battle, they won the war. Mark White got his competency test for a few years, but the teacher unions actually defeated him at the ballot box by supporting a Republican. Okay? But the point that Terry makes is that you had all 50 states doing education reform, but what unfolded was what he called a game of whack-a-mole. Okay, that's the point, right? Basically, Terry says that anytime someone proposed something the unions didn't like, out came the hammer and crush, right? You want to do school choice? Crush. You want to do charter schools? Crush. How about alternative teacher certification? Crush. How about merit pay? Crush, right? And Terry says, look, that the unions, as strong as they are, they don't whack every mole every time, but they whack most of the moles most of the time. Okay. And actually, I think this is a big reason why you see these Florida results is because when I read that story, I said, except in Florida, right? Florida, Governor Bush took the hammer away. He campaigned on education reform. He told people what he was going to do, and he got in office, and he actually did it into the teeth of fierce opposition from the unions and others. When Governor Bush ran for re-election in 2002, you may remember that Janet Reno was running for governor of Florida, and the unions knew that that wasn't going to work. Right? They did their polling, Elian Gonzalez, it wasn't going to happen. Janet Reno was not going to beat Jeb Bush. So basically what they did was they went and recruited a wealthy trial lawyer from Tampa. They helped muscle him through the Democratic primary, defeating Janet Reno. And then they took out a second mortgage on their headquarters in Tallahassee and put it into this guy's campaign and loaned his campaign a whole bunch of staff, including the people who were actually running the effort. Okay? That's how desperate they were to regain their control over K-12 policy, right? Why do we have to fight? Well, from my standpoint, we have to fight because I think the ideas that are most promising, that can actually move the needle and work, are opposed by these interests. And if there was a way to make up with them and sing Kumbaya, I'd be willing to do it, but I don't think there is. Not yet, anyway. I don't know that it'll always be that way. I hope it's not always that way, but that's the way it is.
Could you be more specific about what it is that you think Bush did in Florida that account for the change? And then tell me the 5 states that come closest to that after Florida, and then show me their test scores.
Okay. I'll take your second one first. This year, Indiana passed a set of reforms that is, I would say, is probably even going beyond what Florida's done. But that got done this year. Closest to Florida, maybe Joel Klein's New York City. Let me tell you what the reforms were. Maybe you can tell me. I don't think there are a lot that are real close to what Governor Bush did. The key to Governor Bush.
So Arizona did a lot with choice, right? But that doesn't count. We don't count that.
We screwed up everything else.
And on the graph you had with all the states, and I forget what the bars were where Florida was. So New York was about 4th or 5th on that list. What is it that was New York was doing that was right?
I think Joel Klein did a lot of things that were right. In fact,
that was New York State.
Yeah, it is, but New York City makes up a pretty good portion of New York State, especially when you're looking at free, reduced lunch eligible Hispanic kids, right? So, and let me be clear, I don't think there's one true way to do education. Okay, and I never go and tell people you need to do exactly what Florida. Okay, because there's a diversity of approaches. I think multiple A, B, C, D, or F. That's important because people instantly understand the scale when you see that. When I flew here, actually I flew somewhere else and then flew here. When I drove to the airport, I passed up a school in Arizona that has this big giant banner about as big as that wall. It says, such and such elementary, we are a performing in 9,000 point font, right? Performing school. Now what they don't tell you is a performing is the second lowest possible categorization. Now, we actually just adopted a theory of school grading in 2010. It's starting to be implemented. Now that school is going to be called a D or an F, right, depending on the way it works. The formula for grading schools is also very important because half of it is proficiency based, half of it is based on student learning gains. And the student learning gains, kids in the bottom 25% from last year's test are double weighted. Okay? And what that means is when you're a school principal in Florida and you work game theory out of your head, you're like, wow, I really need to get the kids on the bottom at least moving in the right direction, right? Or my school is going to get a D or an F. Okay? It's a powerful motivator. So in Florida, you not only see big gains for African American students and Hispanic students, you see big gains for ELL students, and you see them for children with disabilities.
But by that notion, shouldn't no child left behind with adequate and inadequate yearly progress is a pretty simple metric too? Shouldn't we see increases all over the country?
I think that no child left behind is probably associated with some gains that Paul pointed out, but you know, it's weak tea compared to what they did before.
Well, it's actually worth $1.5 trillion, no, $15 trillion over the lifetime of those who are in school, according to Rick Hanushek, in present value terms, for taking all students together. So this is his estimate. It's not my estimate, but it's an interesting one. The National Research Council issued a report and said the only benefits we got from No Child Left Behind were 8% of standard deviation, based on different studies that have done the best estimate of what the effects were. Well, as we know from our discussion this morning, 8% of standard deviation is not bad. It's, you know, it's nothing to get terribly excited about. But if it's true, if the 8% of a standard deviation gains that have occurred since 2002, well, that's, and if you say, well, it doesn't get us to Canada, it doesn't get us to Finland, it doesn't get us to Korea, but it does move us up that chart a little bit. And if you work out the returns of having a better educated population over a very long period of time, it's not so trivial. For this simple reason, it is a reform at scale. It was a nationwide intervention. Anything that's a nationwide intervention is almost by definition going to have no effect, right? It's got so much variation, implementation, so much slop and stuff out there. But if you really believe these numbers, you can't sort of just say NCLB. And that's sort of consistent with your Florida story, because your Florida story is Jeb Bush did it a lot better than George did. Jeb did it right, and George, did a bit in the same direction. And so, therefore, you should get a much bigger effect in Florida than you get nationwide.
Right. And I think you're absolutely right. And the fact that you see huge variations between states is telling us, that most of the action is still at the state level, right? Hopefully, Child Left Behind is pushing things along, right? But I think most people would want to move along faster, right? And they did a lot more than just, to get back to your question, I mean, they did a lot more than just that. There was the AITU upgrading, the testing, they put financial incentives into the system.
Minimum class size.
There was a ballot initiative to pass minimum class size, which I think we pretty relatively know didn't have much to do with what happened. Based on the story that Paul actually had, the study that Paul published. There's a lot of pro choice. There's a lot of things that happened all at the same time. Social promotion reforms. A lot of stuff happened all at the same time, or almost the same time. So it's very difficult to tease out. When I go talk to lawmakers in other states, they're always like, "Tell us which one did it, and we'll do that one." Right? And I have to tell them, I don't know. It's impossible impossible to tell. They did a lot of different things at the same time. If you ask Governor Bush what he thinks the main thing is, he'll tell you A through F grading. He thinks that A through F school grading led to a real culture shift over time to move the conversation more to outputs and less from just how much money we're putting into the system, but rather, when your school gets a C, after you stop feeling sorry for yourself, you tend to start thinking about how do you get a B or an A, right? And since it's thoughtfully worked out to highly incentivize gains, plausible.
The tradition in schooling, from what I've seen, is that if you're doing a very good job, especially in the poor area, you're sort of seen as a rate buster, and so people will try to get you in one way or another. And it sounds like it maybe changed that dynamic.
Yeah,
it's hard to get it's hard to get the rate buster when everyone knows you're doing outsiders and they're doing well.
Right. I mean, the opposition at the time was saying that if we label schools D's and F's, which when you look at their name scores in Florida in 1998, they deserved a lot of D's and F's. Right? There would be a cycle of decline, that people would flee the schools, that the staffs would feel demoralized, and that they would get even worse and worse. And what actually happened was quite different from that. I call it truth in advertising. The state actually told the truth about these schools, and Governor Bush put out a public call for people to go and volunteer and tutor, and thousands of people did. You had business executives volunteering their time to help principals, things like that. You saw, this is anecdotal, but you saw the conversations happening at the school district level change from bus routes to, how can we become the first district that doesn't have a C-rated school? So it's a gradual thing. It doesn't happen all at once. And the gains, I just kind of showed you before and after. It's very important to understand the gains were incremental. They happen, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. It's not instant satisfaction.
Okay. Let's make this the last question, and then we'll.
Well, in one of your recent posts on the JP Green blog, you pointed out that they had.
Where can people find that?
I know.
It sounds fascinating. I would love to read it.
You pointed out that basically the growth has stagnated, and that the reforms have essentially stagnated. What does a state like Florida do now?
Well, it's interesting. 2 years ago, I know, again, exactly why they plateaued this year. They didn't significantly decline, but they didn't increase either. When I've asked the people there in Tallahassee on my team about this, there's been a process by which despite the fact that they've made it more difficult to get an A or B 4 different times since they put the system in place, at this point there's way more schools that are A's and B's and D's and F's. It's like 10 to 1 at this point, despite raising the bar. And 2 years ago, my boss and others were lobbying for them to raise the standards again. And the state board decided they didn't want to do that. Right? There's a sense in which, and Governor Bush has always been very clear about this. In fact, he was expecting the 2009 numbers to plateau, and was surprised when they didn't. There's a sense in which you're either rolling the boulder up the hill or it's rolling back at you. What I take away from it is that, wow, it was great to get that decade worth of growth. Now it's time for them to work on another decade of growth. It's not going to fall in their lap. They're going to have to work hard for it.
All right. Well, thank you very much.